Hello, I'm John Molesky. Welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Oge Onubogu, who is director of the Wilson Center's Africa program, and she joins us to share this 10th anniversary publication, Africa a Year in Review, a terrific resource. Oge, congratulations on the latest edition, and welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
So, okay, before we dig into the trend lines that you identify in this publication, I want to spend a minute, since we have you, to talk about some headlines out of the African continent. If you could talk to us about what's happening, the latest in DR Congo, and then also I know we've had some elections recently, if you give us an update on that as well.
Sure. So we see the ongoing conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the rebel group M23 is making significant inroads, or has made significant inroads in Goma. And so this is quite significant, as we're seeing, large numbers of displaced people. We're seeing large concerns about the humanitarian situation over there. One of the points that I always like to highlight for folks is that even before the crisis in Sudan that we're currently seeing, the numbers of internally displaced people that we had in the eastern Congo were one of the largest, if not the largest on the face of this planet. And so this is really concerning, because we're seeing this rebel group M23 has made significant inroads in Goma, moving into Bukavu as well. So definitely one that we should keep our eyes on. The crisis in the DRC is not new. This has been ongoing for several years, and trying to find, it's important that we find a resolution to this sooner rather than later.
Thanks about that. And then also, I know there are some election results that you've been looking at as well.
Yeah, so actually over the weekend, we saw the AU elections. So the AU, there was an election for a new chairperson of the African Union. Pretty dramatic elections as they played out over the weekend, where we saw the foreign minister of Djibouti emerge as the new chairperson of the African Union. With his emergence as chairperson, there are also commissioners that were elected as well. So this chairperson comes in at a time where we see, there are conflicts and crises on the continent that require immediate attention. As we've highlighted, the conflict in the Eastern Congo, we see the crisis in Sudan as well. So there is quite a lot on the new chairperson's plate to address, as well as navigating relationships with the new administration here in the U.S.
Yeah, there'll be no easing into the job. It's going to be hit the ground running.
Definitely hit the ground running in this case.
So tell us about the publication and about the contributors.
So thank you again. So our Africa Year in Review, and I know you put it up before, but I really want to put it up again. Our Africa Year in Review publication, this is our 10th year of putting out this publication. The first was published in 2015. And every year we reach out to policymakers, academics, researchers, people from the private sector in the US and on the African continent, to basically give us some time to take a step back, review the activities or main events or main trends, main events that happened in the previous year, to help inform our thinking and our understanding as we engage in addressing challenges or opportunities that may emerge in the present year, and as well as also informing US-Africa relations in the current year. So we do this on a yearly basis, and this year actually gave us an opportunity to go back and look at some of the publications, some of what we published in the very first edition in 2015, and actually sort of review how things have changed or how some things have actually remained the same. And I think this is really an opportunity for us to look at the trends over a longer term, over a 10-year period. So while we put out these publications on an annual basis, this 10th year edition was an opportunity for us to actually take a longer term view. As we'll notice in this publication, there are some individuals who wrote for us in this current publication who were also authors in 2015. So it was an opportunity for us to go back and ask, have your views changed? Are things still the same? We have quite a wonderful selection of authors in here. We have a current member of Congress who highlights the situation in Sudan. We have a former president from Nigeria, President Olusegun Obasanjo, who shares his reflections on 2024, very honest reflections on how he has seen things play out in West Africa, in Central Africa, in Southern Africa, and also at the continental level. And he's asking questions on, what are lessons we can draw from this to ensure that 2024 wasn't a wasted year, but there are lessons that could be applied as we look at strengthening either U.S.-Africa relations or strengthening networks and connections on the continent for this current year. We also have, a lot of authors who are from the previous U.S. administration who have highlighted some of their areas of work, from the work that they've done in USAID or the work they've done at the Millennium Challenge Corporation or USTDA, and some of the work that the U.S. government has also done in building relationships around the Lobito Corridor project. So it was nice to get some of those perspectives of individuals in government. And then we also have authors who come from multilateral institutions like the UN that share their views on how on the future of multilateralism and what that means for engagement on the African continent, or how things are evolving on the continent. We have, a writer, those who also share their global views and global perspectives of where Africa sits within the global discussions. There is a piece in here that highlights South Africa's presidency of the G20. Now, this is the first time that the presidency of the G20 will be held by an African country, South Africa. And the meeting will also be held in South Africa itself later in the year. So it's a broad range of authors and themes that we've covered in here, that we've sort of placed in 3 different sections, where there are authors who have written on trade and investment. We've looked at a picture on peace and security, and then also looked at Africa's evolving role in the global arena. And all through each of these sections, we look at not only the challenges and opportunities on the continent, but we look at how these will inform U.S.-Africa relations in 2025.
So, and some of the good news is that people can get this publication free of charge, right? There are hard copies here available at the Wilson Center. And if you go online, there's a digital copy available at the Africa program page at wilsoncenter.org. And I just have to say, you sit down with this for a day or a weekend, and you will learn more about goings on the African continent than if you spent maybe a year watching cable news and hope to get that kind of coverage. It's really a terrific resource. Congratulations on that. And it's not just policy. Tell us about the artwork on the cover. You're looking at... So
one of the things that we did with this, since this is our 10th year anniversary, we also wanted to give the publication a refreshed look that also reflects a lot of the changes that we're seeing on the continent. So much has changed, especially within the creative sector on the continent, with many young people involved in the digital space, many young people involved in the creative industry. So the front cover for this edition of Africa Year in Review was actually done by a young Kenyan artist, Lulu Kitolo. And so our goal is to ensure that while we highlight policy issues in Africa Year in Review, that we're also able to use this publication to highlight the work of young and emerging artists from across the continent.
So, Oge, we're not going to do cliff notes for the entire publication. People can read that themselves. But I'm going to ask you about each of the sections, if you would provide sort of an overview thought on anything you want to highlight, a particular country or situation. And we'll start with the section on trade and investment.
So on the section on trade and investment, I actually thought when we were compiling this, we actually thought it was really interesting because the first edition, when it came out in 2015, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, was just reauthorized for 10 years. So 2025 is actually the 10th year anniversary of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, and it's up for renewal. It expires in September of this year, and there are discussions around its renewal. As we went back and we looked at the edition in 2020, in 2015, we realized that some of the discussions that we were having then in 2015 are similar to the discussions that we're having now. And so it was one of the authors who wrote on AGOA in 2015, Flory Liza, who is the chair of the Corporate Council on Africa, actually wrote for this review edition as well. And she was also on the panel for the public event for the launch that we had in early February. I would definitely encourage your viewers to watch the public launch event because we dive into a lot of the themes and topics during that conversation. But it was, I think it was really interesting. And I would encourage those who are working in the area of trade and investment or thinking about how we advance US-Africa trade to go back and look at some of those conversations around AGOA in 2015 to help inform the thinking and understand, to inform the thinking and discussions happening now as we have these conversations about reauthorization, since this act is set to expire in September of this year. Another thing that really struck out in the trade and investment section was that back in 2015, there were conversations about, increase in foreign direct investment and wanting to see more done on the continent where there could be direct investment in infrastructure development, moving away from sort of the aid framework and thinking more about development and how private businesses and the private sector could play a stronger role in investment in infrastructure. Fast forward in this edition, since then, we've seen the creation of Prosper Africa. We've seen the MCC. We've seen a lot of investments that has gone into the Lobito corridor as well. So that conversation that started in 2015 to see the US doing more in investing in the private sector, we see that in the 2024 review that it hasn't just stayed as a conversation, that there are actually some tangible examples now, for some of them still in their early stages, but at least it shows that there's been some change and progress from 2015. So those are some of the areas that I'd like to highlight within the trade and investment side.
Up next is the peace and security piece. And we began our conversation with your update from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Tell us about anything you'd like to highlight from that section.
So I think on the peace and security side, this is one of the areas where we say, sometimes the more things change, the more they remain the same. I think there's an article in here that sort of shows the examples from the 2024 version that shows an example of how the US was able to work to try to bring some peace and stability to the conflict in the DR Congo. So that's an example. And so even though as we see the conflict in the DR, we see sort of a flaring up of the conflict again in the DR Congo, in Eastern DRC, the article in here, it's written by Cicely Brewer. The article in here provides some lessons that we could apply moving forward. I think on the peace and security front too, as well, as I go back to the 2015 to the 2015 edition, there was talk where Burkina Faso, we saw sort of the conversation around Burkina Faso as seeing some progress after the elections. Those were the discussions in 2015. Fast forward to the review in 2024, we're now talking about Burkina Faso as part of, the AES, the Alliance for Sahelian Countries that have now broken away from ECOWAS. So under the peace and security front, as we see progress, we also see, again, as I say, the more things change, the more they remain the same. And I think it's this section in particular pushes us to review how we define success in the field of peace and security, how we define progress, how we set out our markers and milestones or indicators for progress. Are we too quick sometimes to move out of an environment without really addressing the root causes of the problem? And so I think in the peace and security front, while there are, we see the discussions around the different conflicts, it gives us an opportunity to review. Another thing that I want to highlight in that section too as well is that we saw, with the civil war in Sudan, at least a lot of our authors, this 2024 was really a highlight on the situation in Sudan. It was a dire situation in Sudan, the world's largest humanitarian crisis, unfortunately not getting the level of attention, global attention, that it truly deserves. And we see our authors in here. Congressman John James writes about the role that Congress has played to sort of put the situation in Sudan in the spotlight. The co-chair of our Sudan's working group, Ambassador Donald Booth, also highlights as well in his piece with some ideas or examples or things that the administration could pay attention to, where at the end of the day, resolving the conflict in Sudan is the priority. On the peace and security, we also go, to the Horn of Africa too as well. And we see where Turkey plays a mediation role in a crisis in the Horn of Africa. So again, I think to a theme or sort of a point that I raised at the beginning, we see changes, but the more things change, the more things remain the same. So it pushes us to ask ourselves the question, how do we define success? How do we clearly work through different conflicts? How do we identify the different actors that are involved in a conflict to ensure that we reach sustainable conclusions?
Which provides a natural segue to the leadership and governance section, right? Because these things are attached at the hip. Without the proper governance and leadership, these hotspots develop, and if there's going to be a way out, it's going to revolve around leadership and good governance.
Yep. So leadership and good governance, 2024 was a big election year for the continent. Well, not only the continent, it was a mega election year for the entire world, basically. So there were, at the beginning of the year, I believe there were about 19 elections that were scheduled to happen, but we ended up with about, give or take, I think about 16, 17 elections ended up happening in 2024. But at the beginning of the year, there were about 19 on the calendar. In this section of leadership and governance, again, it was nice to get those reflections from the former president of Nigeria, former President Olusegun Obasanjo, who shares his own personal and honest reflections on how things have played out on the continent in 2024. And I think he leaves with a question there. How do we take the lessons from 2024, the lessons in leadership, the lessons in governance? Some of them may not all be perfect lessons, but how do we take those and apply them to 2025 to ensure that what the continent went through in 2024 was not a wasted year? We also see a piece from Afrobarometer. Afrobarometer is a leading research and public opinion institution on the continent. And Afrobarometer, they were actually one of the authors who wrote in some of our previous publications, Africa Year in Review publications, but to see them here highlight the importance of citizen perceptions, of ensuring that development is people-centered. And this is something that this is a theme that we see consistently in all our Africa Year in Reviews, the importance of ensuring that people are at the center of the leadership decisions, of the development decisions, of the governance decisions that are made. Obviously, 2024 was also a big year where we saw young people on the African continent take center stage in Kenya, where there were protests, where young people, in Kenya, they call it the Gen Z protests, where young people across ethnic groups, across religious groups came together to basically protest against some government policies that they didn't agree with. I think 2024 really highlighted the importance of Africa's growing youth demographic and how to ensure that they are engaged effectively.
So on the final piece, global engagement, before we get your thoughts on that, I want to provide a little context for what will be our concluding remarks. And it has to do with something you just mentioned, the youth bulge and the youth demographics. It seems like it's been a long time we've been talking about countries on the African continent in terms of great untapped potential, a youthful demographic that will present all kinds of opportunities and challenges. And then in the final piece, which you had referenced earlier, in the year in review by Alex Vines of Chatham House, the African Union becomes full member of G20. One of the things he writes is it's a watershed moment for amplifying Africa's voice in global forums. And what I'm interested in your thoughts on, Oge, is are we at some sort of inflection point where a lot of what we were talking about as coming soon, the youth demographic bulge, this great untapped potential, is it starting to reach fruition? Are we getting to a point where we're going to see some of this stuff, as you said in some of your earlier comments, go from theory to practice to progress? And then also simmering in the background of this, which we haven't talked about explicitly, is the strategic competition with China in particular, but Russia also has made overtures on the African continent. I know that's a lot of context to give you, and I don't expect you to cover it all in great detail, but if you could maybe talk about that a bit in terms of the concept of global engagement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So before I go to that, I actually just want to touch on one thing on the question of democracy and governance.
Course, please.
I think one of the themes that we saw consistently in 2024 was sort of this narrative of democracy in decline on the continent. Yes. But I think as we take a closer look, that narrative often overlooks sort of the long-term trends and changes that we've seen across the continent. And I think one of the pieces in here also highlights that as well. The piece from the MCC highlights that when we sometimes only talk about democracy in decline, it overlooks some of the progress, some of the changes that we've seen happening across the continent. And as I highlight with the elections that we saw in 2024, we saw elections in Senegal where citizens were at the center of that vote to ensure that a president that was trying to amend the constitution to run for another term in office, to ensure that that didn't happen. And Senegal emerged with the youngest president on the continent after those elections. We saw elections in South Africa, where the leading ANC, for the first time since the end of apartheid, lost its majority and now is in a government of national unity. We saw elections in Botswana, where the party that had been in power since independence lost the elections. We saw elections in Namibia, where Namibia has emerged with a female president. So there were so many dynamic changes that we saw happen on the continent. And so it's important for us to put that into context. What this Africa Year in Review, this 10th year anniversary allows us to do, enables us to do, is to show that, look, there really isn't that sometimes we shouldn't only focus on sort of a linear progression of things. Things change, and we have to be mindful and sort of study the trends closely to see how things change and not get caught up in in one singular narrative.
Yeah,
There
thank
are
you for bringing that up. I mean, really, I think that is instructive for any kind of analysis, right? If you get lost in the headlines, sometimes you're missing the trend lines.
exactly, exactly. And then to your point too, as well, on the question of strategic competition. I think it's important to note that we are going into a multipolar world. And as the world continues to move towards this, on this multipolar spectrum, the African continent, like others too as well, African countries, like several other countries, will continue to look for different partners. Partnership will continue to diversify. And I think when we pull up that question of, strategic competition, and you often hear the comments or sometimes in the headlines where it says, the US is losing Africa to China. China is making a lot of inroads on the African continent. Where is the US? Sometimes I have to tell folks, or very often, not sometimes, this time I tell folks all the time, you need to step back and understand sort of the consistency and predictability in which China and other actors may handle their engagement with countries on the African continent compared to how we in the US engage with the continent, where our engagement with the continent very often is inconsistent and unpredictable. And so this is a wake-up call for the United States that African countries, and I think this is where we go back to the conversation about making sure that we pay attention to citizens' views and citizen perceptions. If we go back to some Afrobarometer data, I think in one of the pieces that they actually published for us, I think it was in our Africa Year in Review in 2021. I think so. I think it was our 2021 edition or 2020, one of those, where their data basically showed that African citizens basically view Chinese influence on the African continent in positive let me rephrase that African countries that view Chinese influence on the continent as positive are also likely to view US engagement in their countries as positive. Now, what we can draw from that data, and this was a survey conducted in 34 countries, what we can draw from that data is that African citizens are not interested in competition.
They're not
African
picking sides. They're not picking sides.
they're not picking sides. So they view the Chinese engagement and US engagement as positive. And so at the end of the day, what does that tell us as the US? Rather than competing, let us define and recognize what our interests are in the different African countries that we engage in. Let us recognize what our comparative advantages are, and then let us think through a longer term approach and a longer term strategy for engagement on the African continent. Early this year, the foreign minister of China traveled. He took a tour across, I believe it was 4 different countries on the African continent. And this was basically keeping in line, maintaining a 35-year tradition that they've always had to begin their diplomatic visits on the African continent. So they're consistent, their approach is predictable. We need to do more on our side, on the US, to build and sustain our relationships with African countries. And as we go back from 2015 to 2024 of our Africa Year in Review, several pieces, several articles here seem to tell that same story, that to strengthen our US-Africa relations, we need to have sort of a clearer approach where we identify our interests, identify what our comparative advantages are, and build out a longer term approach for engagement. And to the point about, as we move into a multipolar world, it's not just about China on the African continent. Turkey, as we saw in the piece about the Horn of Africa, on the Horn of Africa piece, Turkey has stepped up in the region and played a mediation role towards resolving a conflict in what could have been a catastrophe in the Horn of Africa. We see Saudi Arabia stepping up to as well in funding and supporting. UAE, from some reports that we've seen, is now the largest supporter of startups on the African continent. So I think, again, as we move into this space, there are other actors beyond China, beyond Russia, that are at play, and the African African countries see this. They recognize this. I think if you watch the public event, Alex Vines describes it as, and I'm not going to describe it as eloquently as he put it, but I think he said something about alacatism, as in there's several options on the table, and African countries are free to pick from any of these options. It is up to us in the US or in Europe or elsewhere to make ourselves the preferred partner.
I like that challenge. The U.S. is not the only item on the buffet line, so is going to have to compete for space. Okay, thank you. I mean, always for your thoughtful analysis and your insights, and also this publication. Again, I can't endorse it enough or urge people who are watching or listening this program to take a read of it. You'll learn a lot in a very brief time. Time well spent. Thanks, Oge.
Thank you so much, John. It's my pleasure. And again, as you mentioned, the publication is also available online, and we have all the Africa Year Review publications from 2015. If you want to, go back and read and see what has changed, we welcome you to do that.
Which you clearly did, as you referenced them with ease seamlessly.
All of them are online.
Thanks. Our guest has been Oge Onubogu, the director of the Wilson Center's Africa program. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for your time and interest.